East Africa, supposedly the country where that mankind began, and a land that did a lot of trading with the Far East, and some of its wares also found its way across the Sahara into Europe. And again, I've mentioned how that a lot of European gold found its way to China, but what little gold Europe had during the Middle Ages, during the Dark Ages, probably came from Africa. Africa had an abundance of it: gold and diamonds, tin, iron, ivory. Your book shows a map of a string of ports that appeared along the Indian Ocean, joining Africa to the Far East as far as trade. But somewhere along the way, folk, eventually, all these civilizations, all these bright stone cities crumbled and faded, and the people who inhabited them were replaced by tribal peoples. We don't know for sure why, but we find a similar situation happening in Africa that we find happening in North America. If you study a history of the North American Indians, you'll learn that they had tribes that would appear, build large cities, apparently carry on trade, commerce, and then the cities would just vanish. And one such city is the Indian mounds nearby at Etowah, which I happened to visit less than a month ago. The Etowah Indian mounds apparently were inhabited, then abandoned, then inhabited again, and then abandoned again. And but there are some other examples where the tribes would come along and apparently become pretty powerful, pretty wealthy, and then fade. The same thing happened in Africa, where that they would form cities and form nations, and they'd get involved in trade and possibly even had writing, what we might call civilizations. And then somewhere along the way, these civilizations would crumble, and they'd be replaced by tribal people, who people call stateless people. We don't know for sure if the tribal people were jungle people who happened to move in when the civilizations fell, or whether as people abandoned their cities, they moved into the jungle and took up jungle life. But again, folk, it's part of the long struggle that mankind has endured between civilized and uncivilized. And in the struggle between civilized and uncivilized, in the long run, most of the time, the uncivilized people will win. And they'll carry the civilizations sometimes farther down than others. I mean, it happened in Europe also. When the Roman Empire fell, Europe went into a period called the Dark Ages, and Europeans almost became a tribal people themselves, but they remained nations held loosely together, but they nevertheless did not completely become tribal. During the period that the Roman Empire fell, it seems like there was a big decline in culture all over the world. North America, China, the Middle East, big decline in culture that was to only be reversed with the Renaissance that was to come in the 1100s. In Africa, apparently once their decline set in, there was no reversal. It just kept going downhill. Your book goes on to talk about West Africa, particularly one West African country called Ghana. Ghana was located along this region here. This part of Africa is called the African Hump. Ghana was located, it's still located right along here. There's still a nation of Ghana that still exists. It's been around for a long time. Even though, like Ethiopia, Ghana has moved from where it originally was to where it is today. At one time, it looks like Ghana was actually out here and then moved here. We sometimes hear the expression as far away as Timbuktu. And why is that? Because Timbuktu was a city in the middle of the African desert that Europeans could not get to. And they would try to, but the Europeans heard the rumor was there. But every time a European expedition went to find it, they'd be annihilated or they'd die of thirst or whatever. But eventually, The Europeans found the city of Timbuktu, and yes, it's pretty far away from everything else. It might not look so on a map, but at that time, I mean, it was there in the middle of the desert, far, far from any of the location, and that's why we sometimes say they traveled as far as Timbuktu. Again, your book, I'm looking at page 225, shows the routes, and I had a student ask me one time, well, why aren't those routes straight lines? And I said, well, they had to follow wherever the oasis went, or wherever former trade routes went. Maybe they even had to follow valleys, for all I know, but they simply, a lot of times, did not travel in a straight line. But these trails are still used somewhat today, but by following the trails, we're able to construct a history of Africa. Now, your book goes on, after talking about the West, to talk about states in Central Africa and Southern Africa. Yes, folk, Africa did have a lot of states in this region right here, and this region here. These states lasted for centuries before they succumbed to the seeming trend of going stateless or going tribal or going from civilized to uncivilized. Their culture seems to have been going downhill. Now, again, this is opposite what I was taught 40 years ago. 40 years ago, we were taught that Africa had led the way to civilization, but it never quite become civilized. Somewhere along the way, they just simply experienced a cultural lag and never did develop civilizations. Now we know that Africa actually figured prominently into world affairs, and their people might have come over here across the Atlantic, but we know they crossed the Indian Ocean. We know that some people from there crossed over to Africa. So they were part of the world, part of world affairs, but over time, instead of the civilizations rising and failing to rise, their civilizations actually did rise, but over time their civilizations fell. And the people that was left were mostly tribal peoples. Oh yeah, speaking of Timbuktu, your book shows a picture of it on page 228. The city there in the midst of the desert. You can tell there is an oasis there because there's a few of tiny little trees that will probably not amount to much, but nevertheless they are there. Now, the Congo River Valley, that's the land of the jungles, where that it's said that sometimes the forest gets so thick, the rainforest, that if you stick out your hand, you can't even see your hand. Very thick, whole lot of game, whole lot of wildlife. Actually, farther east into Kenya is where a lot of the game hunters used to go. Kenya, Zambia, Tanzania. This part of the Congo, people used to go there and get elephants, or elk, or wild antelope, all the various types of animals that are found in Africa, the wild beast. Africa is full of all kinds of animals. Most of what we know about the people in history comes from outsiders who went to these places and wrote about them. And one person said the people of the Congo live in huts that they put together from plant life, but the huts do not keep out the rain. Now, I've heard otherwise. I've heard that a thatched hut, if done right, will keep the rain out, but your book says that these thatched huts that they built do not keep out the rain. They had a very strong civilization in Zimbabwe for a time, but after a while it failed also. All right. Your book then speculates about the history of Africa. Is it a continent without a history? No, they had a history. even though for a time it was looked on to say these people have no history. But something else that they did, I mean, I've told you how they memorized the names of their ancestors. They also memorized their history. An old man would gather a bunch of kids around him at the campfires, and he would tell stories. And these stories would be passed down a generation. When the old man passed on, the kids would take up and they would tell the stories to a younger generation. And their histories were passed down by word of mouth. And some people believe if we could collect enough of these stories, we might be able to reconstruct the history of Africa. But the problem is, so many people who told these stories died without passing them on to the next generation. African people went through, in modern times, have gone through AIDS. But before that, they went through a period of enslavement. Enslavement began, well, all right, let me back up a bit. Slavery has always been a part of Africa's history. Yes, even in the year 2014. There have been all kinds of stories about slavery in the land of Sudan. It's been discussed at the United Nations here in New York. There are stories about slavery in the Congo. And there are stories about an evil man who has grabbed up a whole bunch of young girls and made slaves out of them. And from time to fact, last spring I had a student write a paper on this subject. But African slaves found their way into Roman cities and into Roman households. But then in the 1400s, when Europeans, particularly Spanish and Portuguese, began to sail farther and farther south around Africa, they began to take slaves back to Spain and Portugal. Then when the New World was discovered, it was found out the American Indians were not particularly good plantation workers. Europeans began to take slaves out of Africa, and they took so many slaves out of Africa that it somewhat depopulated the region. I mean, it actually had a big cut into the population quite a bit and contributed to African culture and African civilization such as it was left going farther and farther downhill. But slavery, again, a big part of Africa's history has been. Now, eventually, the Americas outlawed slavery. Regrettably, one of the last nations to outlaw slavery was the United States. Most of these Latin American countries outlawed slavery as soon as they got their independence from Spain. Mexico did in 1820, and then Colombia and all these countries, except Brazil. Brazil did not outlaw slavery until 1880, 15 years after the United States did. Again, Brazil was not a Spanish colony, it was Portuguese. But the Spanish were driven out of Latin America during the Napoleonic Wars, and by 1820, all the Spanish colonies were, except for Puerto Rico and Cuba and a few of the islands. Otherwise, the Spanish were driven out, driven off the mainland. And these new countries would form outlawing slavery. Brazil did not until they were embarrassed out of it. You might say shamed out of it by 1880, but they were embarrassed. They were the only country in the Western world that still allows it. And if the United States had not fought a 4-year-long civil war, it is likely that by the year 1900, slavery would have been outlawed in the United States also, because your southern plantation owners would have found themselves shamed out of it as the world got, you might say, smaller and smaller, and more people around the world were condemning the South for its slavery. And also the price of slaves was going up while the price of cotton was going down. This might have forced slave owners to get rid of slavery. It's likely that slavery would have been gone out of practice by the year 1900 if it had not been outlawed in 1865. But slavery has been a big part of Africa's history down through time. In fact, one colony, the United States, to freed a bunch of slaves and sent them back to Africa. They went to the country of Liberia, because the word Liberia means free people, liberty, and they sold each other into slavery. The strong ones enslaved the weak. Liberia is making news because of the present Ebola crisis. Anyway, still a big part of African society. All right, Um, Historians, again, have tried for years to piece together African history, trying to get as much as they can from African traditions, which are at best difficult to believe. And trying to wonder how much they can rely on the genealogies that they memorized, or get a history of the people who visited Africa and came back home and wrote about it. But again, accounts of visitors are sometimes stretched. Human memory at best is sometimes frail and feeble. As you know, if you read the same book twice, I mean, hey, I read this book a couple of years ago, look at it again, it doesn't say what we remember it said. Again, because human memory, or watch the same movie twice, watch it once, turn around, watch it a couple of years later, and hey, this is not the way I remember it. Same way with events. You and somebody else can participate in the same event, then you can declare that the event occurred one way and the other person declare, no, I remember it clearly, it occurred another.